The cold was the first thing Sigrid knew each morning. It seeped through the moss and mud chinking of her cabin walls, a persistent guest in the deep of the northern woods. It lived in the floorboards and clung to the wool of her blanket. Before her eyes even opened, she would curl her fingers and toes, a small, futile protest against the chill that was as much a part of her life as breathing. This morning the cold carried a scent. Pine, yes, always pine. But beneath it, the metallic tang of fresh blood and the damp fur smell of wolf. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed, pulling on her worn leather trousers and a thick tunic. Her heart didn't race. It settled into a low, steady rhythm, the beat of a drum calling her to work. 41 days. For 41 days the pack had come. Every dawn a new offering left on the flat stone before her door. A fox with a leg caught in a snare, a young doe gored by a boar, a fledgling eagle with a broken wing, and wolves. So many wolves. Pups with milk fever, old hunters with splintered bones in their jaws, she-wolves torn in birthing. She had not lost one, not a single one. The thought brought no pride. It was simply a fact, like the rising of the sun or the inevitable fall of snow. Her hands knew what to do. Her gut knew which herbs to grind. The forest gave her what she needed, and she gave it back to the forest's children. It was the only conversation she was allowed anymore. She pushed open the heavy plank door. The air outside was sharp, a blade against her cheeks. And there, on the stone, was not a fox or a deer. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was huge, a giant sprawled on the cold rock, his broad shoulders and long limbs taking up the entire space. He was dressed in dark, ruined leathers, slashed and soaked through with blood that had frozen into black, crystalline patterns. A great wolf pelt, its fur the color of ash, was thrown over him, but it too was matted and dark. Around him, silent as ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom, sat the pack. The great alpha, Silver Eye, was at their head. His one good eye, the color of a winter sky, was fixed on her. The other was a scarred white ruin, a wound she had cleaned and stitched herself weeks ago. He did not growl. He did not move. He simply watched, waiting. This was their offering, their greatest challenge yet. Sigrid's breath plumed in the air. Fear was a distant cousin, a voice she hadn't heard in years. What she felt was a deep, resonant hum of responsibility. They had brought him to her. They trusted her. She knelt beside the man. His face was turned away, half buried in the pelt. What she could see was pale as bone, smeared with dirt and more blood. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, dusted with frost. He was utterly still. Too still. Was he already gone? She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and pressed them to the side of his neck. The skin was cold, ice cold. For a sickening second she thought she'd failed before she even began. Then she felt it. A pulse. Faint. Thready. A butterfly's wing beating against the wall of death. But it was there. She looked up at Silver Eye. The great wolf dipped his head once, a slow, deliberate motion. The rest of the pack began to melt back into the trees, their silent trust left behind with the broken man on the stone. "All right," she whispered to the still figure, her voice rough from disuse. "All right. Let's see what they've done to you." Getting him inside was a battle. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. He slid a few inches on the slick, frosted stone, and then stopped. It was like trying to move an oak tree. She grunted, planting her feet, her muscles screaming in protest. The scent of him was overwhelming now. Blood and winter and something else. Something wild and clean, like the air after a lightning strike. It was a scent that felt impossibly familiar, a song she knew but couldn't name. Inch by painful inch, she dragged him across the threshold of her cabin. The floorboards groaned under his weight. She managed to get him to the hearth, his boots leaving a wet, dark trail behind them. There, she let him fall. The sound was a sickening thud of meat and bone. She stood over him, panting, her hands on her knees. The fire was down to embers. She threw on more logs, coaxing the flames back to life with a dry pine cone. Light flickered, dancing over his still form. Now she could see the extent of the damage. It was his side. A massive, gaping wound tore through his leather tunic and the flesh beneath. It looked like the raking claws of some great beast, or perhaps several. The edges were ragged, blue with cold. It wasn't bleeding freely anymore. The chill had slowed it, but that was its own danger. "You foolish, foolish man," she murmured, her hands already moving, gathering what she needed. Dried yarrow to staunch the bleeding, willow bark for the pain he'd feel if he ever woke up, and her precious store of moss from the sunken bogs, the kind that fought off any rot. She needed to get the wet, cold clothes off him. Her cheeks burned at the thought, a strange heat in the frozen cabin. She was a healer. This was just flesh and bone, sinew and blood. It didn't matter that he was a man, but it did. It had been 6 years since she had touched another person. 6 years since her stepmother's guards had thrown her from the gates of the main settlement with nothing but the clothes on her back and the brand on her arm that marked her as an outcast. She pushed the thought away. It was a ghost that had no place here. Here, there was only the work. With her sharpest knife, she cut away the ruined tunic. The leather was thick, but her blade was honed. It parted, revealing the landscape of his torso. It was a road map of old scars, pale white lines against a skin that, even in its deathly pallor, was corded with muscle. This was a warrior, a man who lived by the sword and the claw, and he was beautiful. The thought ambushed her. It was absurd. He was half dead, caked in filth and blood. But the breadth of his shoulders, the harsh line of his jaw, the sheer, uncompromising reality of him. It was beautiful in the way a storm-battered mountain was beautiful, terrible and magnificent. She shook her head, angry with herself. She was a healer, not a girl to be moonstruck by a handsome face. She worked quickly, her movements efficient. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, her touch gentle as she wiped away the grime and blood. The flesh was colder than it should be. A deep, unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from his very bones. It wasn't just the winter air. It was something inside him. As she worked, his head lolled to the side. For the first time, she saw his face clearly in the firelight. It wasn't a young face. Lines were carved around his eyes and mouth, testament to a long, hard life. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and she knew him. Not his name, not his station, but she knew his face from the stories, from the coins that sometimes passed through the hands of the rare trappers she traded with. The hawkish nose, the strong, unforgiving jaw, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. This was Callum, the Alpha King. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The king. The pack had brought her the king of all wolves, the ruler of the entire northern waste. Why? Why him? Why here? He was supposed to be untouchable, a figure of legend, a warrior who hadn't known defeat in 200 years. A king so powerful his own pack was terrified of him. Cold, ruthless, alone. And here he was, bleeding out on her floor. Panic, the old familiar ghost, finally found her. Her hands started to shake. She couldn't do this. If he died here, in her hut, what would they do to her? They wouldn't just cast her out. They would tear her apart. She looked at the brand on her forearm, a stylized rune for barren and unclaimed, a mark her stepmother had insisted upon, a mark that made her less than a wolf, less than a person. If they found the king dead in the hut of a branded outcast, she should run, pack what little she had and disappear deeper into the woods, where not even the wolves could find her. Her eyes fell on his face again. He looked lost. Not like a king, just a man, broken and at the mercy of the cold. The pulse had been a butterfly's wing. Without her, it would stop. And the pack. Silver Eye's gaze. They had not brought him to her as a threat. They had brought him for the same reason they brought the fox and the eagle. They had brought him for healing. They had trusted her. Her trembling stopped. Her jaw tightened. She was Sigrid. She was the healer of this forest, and she had not lost a patient in 41 days. Today would not be the day she started. "You are not a king here," she whispered to his unconscious form, her voice gaining strength. "Here, you are just a wound, and I am the one who mends." She turned back to her work, her fear burned away by a cold, clear purpose. She packed the great gash with the bog moss, the green fibers stark against his pale skin. She ground the yarrow and willow bark into a paste and spread it carefully. Then, with a sterilized bone needle and sinew thread, she began to stitch. Her hands were steady now. The needle dipped and rose, pulling the torn edges of a king's flesh back together. The world shrank to the firelight, the scent of herbs, and the slow, painful mending of this impossible man. For 3 days, he did not wake. He burned with fever, his skin shifting from ice cold to furnace hot. Sigrid barely slept. She forced broth and herbal teas between his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. She bathed his face with cool water, listening to the fragments of words he muttered in his delirium. Names she didn't know, places she couldn't imagine, and one word, over and over, a plea. Mine. He would thrash in his sleep, his powerful body fighting invisible enemies. During those moments she would speak to him, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told him about the herb she was using, about the snowshoe hare that had watched her from the woodpile that morning, about the way the ice sounded when it cracked on the river. She spoke of small, simple things, anchoring him to the living world. Sometimes, when his fever was at its worst, she would lay her hands on his chest. Not to heal. She had no such power. But just to feel the frantic beat of his heart, to offer what little warmth she had against the profound cold that still clung to him. In those moments she felt a strange pull, a resonance between them that hummed deep in her bones. It frightened her, but she couldn't pull away. On the 4th morning the fever broke. She awoke on her stool by the hearth to find him watching her. His eyes were open. They were the color of molten gold, intelligent and shockingly aware. The delirium was gone. He looked at her, his gaze intense, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she felt a flicker of real fear. This was not the broken man. This was the king. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, a gravelly ruin, but it held an undeniable core of command. Sigrid's throat went dry. She couldn't tell him her name. Her name was linked to her past, to the brand. She was nobody. "The one who stitched you together," she said, her voice quiet. He seemed to consider this. His eyes scanned the small cabin, taking in the drying herbs, the neatly stacked firewood, her small cot in the corner. His gaze came back to her. It was heavy, like a physical weight. "Where is this?" "The Whisperwood, north of the Black River." A flicker of something. Surprise? Confusion? Crossed his face. "How did I get here?" "The pack brought you," she said simply. That seemed to silence him. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. She could see the thoughts turning behind those golden eyes. He was a king, piecing together his world. He had been defeated, left for dead, and woken up in a hermit's hut miles from any known settlement. He tried to sit up, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. He got halfway before his face went pale, and he fell back against the furs. "Don't," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You'll tear the stitches. You lost too much blood. You need to rest." He glared at her, a flash of the legendary alpha temper. "I do not take orders." "Here, you do," she countered, meeting his gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she would not look away. "Or you can bleed to death on my floor. The choice is yours." She expected him to rage, to try and force himself up, to assert his authority. Instead, a slow, grudging smile touched his lips. It was a faint, painful thing, but it transformed his harsh face. "You have a healer's nerve," he rasped. "What is your name?" She hesitated. "They call me the Forest Witch." It was what the trappers called her, a name meant to keep others away. A name that kept her safe. He didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes, but he didn't press. "Fine, Forest Witch. Bring me water." She did. She held the cup to his lips, her hand steady, trying to ignore the way his eyes tracked her every movement. He drank deeply. When he was done, he lay back, his energy spent. "My men," he started, his voice strained. "There was no one," she said softly. "Just you. And the wolves." The look on his face was bleak. She saw the king then, the commander who had lost his men. The guilt was a shadow in his golden eyes. For the first time, she felt a pang of something other than fear or duty. She felt pity. "Rest," she said, her voice gentle now. "Rest is the only medicine that will work now." He closed his eyes, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. He was listening. To the fire, to her movements, to the sound of her breathing. The king was awake, and her small, quiet world had been fractured forever. He healed with the unnatural speed of his kind, but the wound had been grievous. For the next week, he was confined to the furs by the fire. He was a terrible patient. He hated being still, hated being weak. He chafed under her care, questioning every herb she used, every instruction she gave. "What is that?" he would demand as she ground roots in her mortar. "King's foil," she'd reply without looking up. "It cleanses the blood." "It smells like dirt." "It is dirt. Now drink it." Their days fell into a strange rhythm, a tense dance of her quiet competence and his restless authority. He never told her who he was, and she never let on that she knew. He was just Cal, a name he'd offered one afternoon, a clipped, hard sound that felt as incomplete as the rest of his story. She learned to read the landscape of his moods. The tightening of his jaw meant his pain was sharp. The distant look in his eyes meant he was thinking of his lost men. The drumming of his fingers on the floor meant his patience had worn thin, and she found herself watching him, more than she should. She watched the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair. She watched the powerful muscles in his arms as he began to push himself up. She listened to the deep timbre of his voice, even when he was complaining. One evening he was sitting up, leaning against the wall, his gaze fixed on the flames. The silence in the cabin was thick, comfortable. "Why do you live out here?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. "Alone." The question startled her. She paused in her mending of his torn pelt. "It's peaceful." "It's empty," he countered. "No one should be this alone." His words were a stone dropped into the still pool of her solitude. He saw it. He saw the loneliness she had pretended for 6 years did not exist. A lump formed in her throat. "Some of us don't have a choice," she said, her voice tight. She kept her eyes on her needlework, her knuckles white as she gripped the thick fur. He was silent for a long time. She could feel his golden eyes on her, feel his gaze trying to unravel the secrets she held so tightly. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with steel. She flinched. Did what? Made you believe you didn't have a choice. She looked up then, shocked. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her arm, at the sleeve of her tunic. She always wore long sleeves. Always. But it had ridden up as she worked, and he had seen it. The brand. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded through her. She yanked the sleeve down, her face burning. She felt exposed, judged. The old wound, the one no herb could heal, was split open. It's none of your concern, she snapped, her voice trembling. He didn't apologize. He didn't look away. Anything that hurts you, he said, his voice a low growl, is my concern. The words hung in the air between them. It was a possessive, arrogant statement. The statement of a king. But the way he said it. It wasn't about ownership. It was about protection. A promise. Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her shame and seen an injury to be avenged. She didn't know what to say. She stood abruptly, turning her back to him, pretending to be busy with the herbs hanging from the rafters. She could feel his gaze on her back, a tangible warmth. This was dangerous. This feeling that was unfurling in her chest, a fragile green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. It was hope, and hope was a fool's game. He was the king. She was an outcast. He would heal, and he would leave. He would return to his world of power and politics, and she would be left here, in the cold, with a silence that was twice as loud as before. She had to remember that. She had to guard her heart. But as she stood there, with her back to him, she heard him shift. He was trying to stand. She turned, ready to scold him, but he was already on his feet. He was unsteady, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the wall. But he was standing. He was magnificent, tall and powerful, even in his weakened state. He took one step, then another. He walked towards her, his golden eyes never leaving her face. He stopped an arm's length away. He was so tall, she had to crane her neck to look at him. Thank you, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a king's gratitude. I'm a healer, she whispered. It's what I do. You did more than that, he said, his voice dropping lower. You kept the shadows at bay. He raised a hand, slowly, as if not to startle her. He hesitated for a second, then his fingers brushed her cheek. His touch was rough, calloused, but unbelievably gentle. It was warm, the first kind human touch she had felt in 6 years. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped from her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. His expression softened. With his thumb, he wiped the tear away. No more of that, he murmured. Not while I'm here. She was falling, and she didn't know how to stop. Cal, or Callum, as she knew him to be, stayed. His wound was healing, the angry red fading to a puckered pink line, a new scar to add to his collection. He was growing stronger every day. He started by chopping her firewood, the axe swinging with an easy, practiced power that made her stomach flutter. Then he began hunting, disappearing into the woods for hours and returning with rabbits or grouse. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both deeply strange and terrifyingly natural. They ate their meals together by the fire. He would tell her stories of battles, never mentioning his rank, painting himself as a simple captain. She would listen, her chin propped on her hand, fascinated by the world he came from. She never spoke of her past. He never asked about the brand again. It was an unspoken truce, a fragile peace built in the space between what was said and what was known. But the outside world began to intrude. First, it was a lone wolf, a scout from the main pack, who appeared at the edge of the clearing. He did not approach the cabin, but sat and watched, a silent gray sentinel. Cal saw him, A look passed between them, a conversation she couldn't decipher. The next day, the scout was gone. A week later, a man appeared. He was dressed in the dark gray uniform of the King's Guard, his face grim. He stopped at the tree line, his hand on the hilt of his sword, his eyes wide as he saw Cal standing by the woodpile. "My lord," the man breathed, dropping to one knee. Cal's face hardened. He shot a look at Sigrid, who was standing frozen in the doorway of the cabin. A look of sharp regret. The game was up. He walked to the guard, his voice a low, angry command. "What are you doing here, Torin? I gave orders." "The council grows restless, my king," the guard, Torin, said, his head still bowed. "Lord Valerius spreads rumors of your death. He says the succession must be discussed. The kingdom is on a knife's edge." "King." The word was said aloud now. It dropped into the quiet clearing like a bomb. Sigrid felt the blood drain from her face. It was one thing to know it in her heart. It was another to have it confirmed, to see this hard, proud warrior kneel before him. The distance between them, which she had tried so hard to ignore, was suddenly a chasm, a gaping canyon she could never hope to cross. Callum's shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his hair. Valerius. Of course. He looked back at Sigrid, and the regret in his eyes was so deep it hurt her to see. "I need to go back." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. The idyll was over. "I know," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. He dismissed Herin, who retreated back into the woods. Then he walked back to her, his steps heavy. "Sigrid," he began, using her real name for the first time. She flinched, not realizing he even knew it. He must have heard it in his fever dreams. "I never meant to deceive you." "You didn't," she lied, wrapping her arms around herself. The cold was back, seeping into her bones. "I knew you weren't a simple soldier. I needed—" He struggled for the words. "I needed the quiet. I needed to heal. Without the weight of the crown." He reached for her, but she took a step back. She couldn't let him touch her. If he touched her, she would break. "You should go," she said, her voice flat. "Your kingdom needs you." The hurt on his face was a fresh wound. "I will come back for you," he said, his voice fierce. "A king's decree. This is not over." "There is nothing to come back for," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I am an outcast. You are the king. The world does not allow for such things." "I am the king," he growled, his golden eyes flashing. "I will make the world allow it." He looked like he wanted to say more, to argue, to shake her. But he didn't. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, his own internal battle raging on his face. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and strode into the forest, following the path his guard had taken. He was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical thing. It pressed in on her, deafening. The cabin felt huge, empty. The fire seemed to give off less warmth. She had known this would happen. She had prepared herself for it. So why did it feel like he had torn out her heart and taken it with him? 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of crushing silence. The pack no longer brought her wounded animals. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sigrid went through the motions of her life, gathering herbs, tending the fire, sleeping. But it was all gray. The color had been leached from her world. She told herself it was for the best. He was the king. He had duties, a kingdom to rule. She was a ghost in the woods. Their time together had been a fever dream, a brief, impossible warmth in the long winter of her life. Then, they came for her. Not one guard, but a dozen. They surrounded her cabin, their gray uniforms stark against the snow that had begun to fall. They were led by a woman, tall, elegant, her face a mask of cold beauty. Her silver hair was coiled in an intricate braid, and her gown was the color of blood. Sigrid knew her instantly. Though she was older, her face harsher, there was no mistaking her. Ilara, her stepmother. Well, well, Ilara said, her voice dripping with disdain as she took in the small, rough cabin. Look what the wolves dragged in. I always knew you belonged in the dirt. Sigrid's hands clenched into fists. What do you want? The king has made a sentimental proclamation, Ilara said, examining her nails. He intends to bring a forest witch to court, to make her his queen. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The council, of course, was horrified. A branded barren outcast for a queen? Unthinkable. It would destabilize the entire kingdom. So he had tried. The thought was a painful spark in the darkness of her chest. He had tried to keep his promise. I was tasked, Ilara continued, her eyes narrowing, with resolving the situation, with reminding the king of his duty. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over Sigrid with contempt. He is weak. Love has made him a fool, but he will listen to reason, especially when his pet is no longer a distraction. The guards moved, their intent clear. They were not here to escort her. They were here to erase her. Leave, Sigrid said, her voice low and shaking with a rage she hadn't felt in years. This is my home. You are not welcome here. Ilara smiled, a cold, cruel thing. You have nothing. You are nothing. You think you can command me? She gestured to the guards. Take her. They advanced. Sigrid backed away, her heart pounding. She was trapped. But as her back hit the cold logs of her cabin wall, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a bedrock of defiance hardened. She had saved a king. She had faced down death itself. She would not be broken by this woman. Not again. I said leave, she repeated, and this time her voice did not shake. It resonated with a power she didn't recognize. As the first guard reached for her, a low growl echoed from the trees. Silver Eye stepped out of the woods, and behind him, the entire pack, dozens of them. They fanned out, a silent gray wall of muscle and teeth, their eyes fixed on the guards. Ilara's eyes widened in shock. The guards froze, their hands hovering near their swords. They were warriors, but they were outnumbered 10-1 by the deadliest predators in the north. What is this? Ilara hissed. Witchcraft? This is my family, Sigrid said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. She looked at Silver Eye, at the pack that had sustained her, trusted her. They had not abandoned her. A standoff. The air crackled with tension. The guards were afraid. She could smell it on them. But they were bound by their orders. Ilara was bound by her hate. Then, a new sound. The thunder of hooves. Callum burst into the clearing, his horse lathered in sweat. He wasn't wearing his crown, but he had never looked more like a king. His face was a mask of cold fury, his golden eyes blazing. He vaulted from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, landing with a wolf's grace. His gaze took in the scene in an instant. The guards, Ilara, the pack, and Sigrid, pressed against her cabin wall. Ilara, he said, and his voice was the sound of an avalanche. What is the meaning of this? His stepmother drew herself up, her composure returning. Your Majesty, I am simply cleaning up a political embarrassment. The council will not accept this creature. I was not addressing the council, Callum snarled, taking a step forward. I was addressing you. You dare to come to her home with armed men? You dare to threaten the woman I intend to make my queen? Every word was a hammer blow. He was declaring it, here, in front of everyone. She is a branded outcast, Ilara shrieked, her mask of civility cracking. She will bring ruin. Is your infatuation worth your crown? Your kingdom? This was the threat, the political crisis made manifest, her or the kingdom. The choice Ilara was forcing on him. Callum's eyes met Sigrid's over the heads of the guards. She saw the conflict in them, the terrible weight of his choice. He loved her. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. But he was a king first. He had a duty to his people, and she loved him, enough to not let him throw away his kingdom for her. She took a breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She had to end this. She had to make the choice for him. She's right, Sigrid said, her voice clear and steady. Every eye in the clearing turned to her. I will not be the cause of a civil war. I will not have your kingdom bleed for me. Callum's face twisted in pain. Sigrid, no. It's all right, Callum, she said, and she gave him a small, sad smile. My life has been my own for 6 years. I will not have it be the price of yours. She looked at Ilara, her gaze unflinching. I will go. I will disappear. You will have what you want. Ilara looked triumphant. The guards relaxed. Callum looked broken. No, he whispered. He started towards her, but his own guards, loyal to the council's decree, moved to block his path. He was a king, but he was also a prisoner. They were both trapped. In the king's castle, the cold was different. It was the cold of stone and shadows, of silent judgment and whispered plots. Sigrid was not in a dungeon, but her chambers felt like one. They were luxurious, filled with silks and velvets, but the door was guarded, and the window looked out over a sheer drop. A gilded cage. Callum was fighting for her. She heard it through the whispers of the serving girls, saw it in the grim faces of the guards. He met with the council daily, his voice echoing through the stone halls as he argued, commanded, and pleaded. But the opposition was entrenched, led by her stepmother, Ilara, who had masterfully painted Sigrid as a dangerous, low-born charlatan who had ensorcelled the king. The brand on her arm was the core of their argument. A woman marked as barren could never be queen. The royal line had to continue. It was law. It was tradition. They were at an impasse. The kingdom was fracturing. Lords loyal to Callum were gathering their forces, while those who followed the council's lead were sharpening their blades. It was exactly what she had feared. A war, with her at its center. Callum came to her at night, slipping past his own guards. He looked haunted, the lines on his face deeper than ever. The weight of his crown was crushing him. This is madness, he said one night, pacing her chambers like a caged wolf. They will tear the kingdom apart over this. Then let me go, she pleaded, her heart aching at the sight of his pain. Callum, please, just let me go back to my forest. They will forget me. You can rule. He stopped, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was tight, desperate. And live the rest of my centuries alone, as I was before? I will not, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I searched for you for 200 years, Sigrid. I felt the echo of our bond, a ghost I chased across the entire continent. I will not lose you now that I have found you. His confession stole her breath. He had been looking for her. That strange resonance she felt, that feeling of familiarity. It was the bond. But your kingdom. You are my kingdom, he roared, his control finally snapping. He lowered his voice, his forehead resting against hers. You are. I didn't know how empty my life was until you filled it. I would rather have a hut in the woods with you than this stone tomb without you. Tears streamed down her face. In the midst of this crisis, this despair, he was choosing her. Utterly, unconditionally. I love you, she whispered. The words she had held back for so long finally breaking free. I love you, and it's tearing me apart to see what it's costing you. It costs me nothing, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He tilted her chin up, his golden eyes blazing into hers. Losing you, that is the only cost I am not willing to pay. And he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, a drowning man's gasp for air. It was all their fear and longing and love poured into one moment. She clung to him, returning the kiss with all the fierce, desperate love in her own soul. The world outside, the council, the war, it all fell away. There was only him. But the world did not stay away for long. The next day, the council delivered its ultimatum. A formal trial would be held. Sigrid would be judged. If she was found unworthy, and Alara had ensured the verdict, she would be exiled under pain of death. If the king refused to accept the verdict, he would be deemed to have abandoned his throne, and the council would name a successor. They were cornered. It was over. The great hall was silent. Every lord and lady of the northern waste was present, their faces grim. Sigrid stood on a raised dais in the center of the room, alone. Callum sat on his throne, his face carved from stone, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. Across from him, on a slightly lower seat, sat Alara, her expression serene, victorious. The trial was a farce. Witnesses came forward, coached by Alara, telling tales of Sigrid's dark magic and low birth. They twisted her healing of the forest animals into sinister witchcraft. They presented the brand on her arm as irrefutable proof of her unworthiness. Sigrid said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her fate had been sealed the moment she was born. Finally, the head of the council, a grim old wolf named Lord Valerius, stood to deliver the verdict. "The council has deliberated," he intoned, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "We find the woman known as Sigrid to be unfit, by birth and by mark, to be the king's consort. She is hereby sentenced to exile. Should she ever return to the king's lands, the penalty is death." A gasp went through the crowd. It was the harshest possible sentence short of execution. Valerius turned to the throne. "Your Majesty, do you accept the council's judgment?" This was the moment, the choice. Sigrid's heart stopped. She looked at Callum, trying to send him a silent message. "Let me go. Save your kingdom. Survive." Callum rose slowly from his throne. His golden eyes swept across the council, across the assembled lords, and finally they came to rest on her. The agony in them was a physical wound. She saw the word forming on his lips. No, he was going to throw it all away. For her. She couldn't let him. "I accept the sentence," Sigrid said, her voice ringing out in the silence. Every head snapped towards her. Callum froze, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "Sigrid, no!" he commanded. She ignored him, her eyes fixed on the council. "I accept your judgment," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. She was choosing this. This was not a defeat. It was a sacrifice, a final act of love for the man she would not allow to be ruined. "I will leave, and I will not return." She looked at Callum, her heart breaking. "Be a good king," she whispered, a message only for him. She felt a strange peace settle over her. She had been an outcast before. She could be one again. She accepted it. She accepted the loneliness, the cold, the emptiness. She accepted death, if it came to that, if it meant he was safe. As the acceptance settled in her soul, a deep, final letting go of any hope for herself, something happened. It started as a hum, deep in the stone beneath her feet. A vibration that traveled up through the soles of her boots, into her bones. The air grew thick, smelling of rich soil and spring rain. A faint green light began to glow from the cracks between the flagstones around her. The crowd murmured, confused, afraid. Alara shot to her feet, her face pale with shock. Sigrid looked down. The light was growing brighter, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Where the light touched the stone, tiny green shoots were pushing their way through, unfurling delicate leaves. In the heart of a stone castle, in the depths of winter, Life was erupting from the floor. The power that had hummed in her blood, the connection she'd felt to the forest. It wasn't just a healer's intuition. It was real. It was elemental. A power over life itself, over the very earth she stood on. Vines, thick as her wrist, snaked up from the floor, coiling around the dais. They didn't threaten. They adorned. They wrapped around her ankles, her waist, climbing her arms like living jewelry. Roses, the deep red of a wolf's blood, bloomed in an instant, their fragrance filling the hall. She raised her head. She felt whole. The part of her that had always felt empty was now overflowing with a quiet, immense power. The land. The land itself was answering her. It was claiming her. The brand on her arm began to burn. She cried out, not in pain, but in shock. She looked down and saw the ugly rune glowing with a fierce white light. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was impossible to look at. And then it faded. Where the brand had been, the skin was clean, unmarked, perfect. The lie had been burned away by the truth of the land itself. She was not barren. She was life. The hall was utterly silent. Everyone stared, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Sigrid looked at her stepmother. Alara was trembling, her face ashen. She wasn't looking at Sigrid with hate anymore. She was looking at her with a kind of horrified recognition, as if seeing a ghost from her own past. Then Sigrid looked at Callum. He was no longer by his throne. He was walking towards her, his steps slow, deliberate. His guards did not dare stop him. He walked through the impossible garden that had sprung up around her, his golden eyes filled with a love and reverence so profound it made her weak. He stopped before her, reaching out a hand. He didn't touch the vines or the flowers. He touched her face, his fingers gentle on her cheek. "I knew," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The moment I saw you, my soul knew. You were not a witch. You were a queen." He knelt. The Alpha King, the ruler of the North, knelt in the dirt and flowers at her feet, in front of his entire court. "My queen," he said, his head bowed. And in that moment she was not Sigrid the outcast. She was not the forest witch. She was the land, and the land was hers. She was home. The council, 201, followed their king's lead. They knelt. Lord Valerius, the lords and ladies, the guards. They all sank to their knees, their heads bowed to the woman they had just condemned. The power she wielded was not magic they could fight. It was the lifeblood of their world. To deny her was to deny the earth beneath their feet. Callum rose, his eyes never leaving hers. He took her hand, the one that had been branded, and raised it to his lips. His kiss was a seal, a promise. "The bond is complete," he murmured, for her ears only. "Your power, mine, the land, it is all one." She finally understood. The unnatural cold in him, the centuries of searching. He was a king of winter, of endings. She was a queen of spring, of new beginnings. He was the claw, she was the soil. Apart, they were incomplete. Together, they were a cycle. They were balance. She looked over his shoulder at her stepmother. Alara was the only one left standing, a lone, rigid figure in a kneeling court. Her face was a ruin of conflicting emotions, fear, envy, and a deep, soul-crushing sadness. Later, after the court had been dismissed in a state of stunned silence, Callum led her not to the royal chambers, but to a small private garden at the heart of the castle. It was a barren place, the winter-blasted skeletons of rose bushes stark against a thin layer of snow. "This was my mother's garden," he said quietly. "It has not bloomed since she died, 300 years ago." Sigrid walked to the center of the garden. She knelt, placing her palm flat on the frozen earth. She closed her eyes, not commanding, but asking. She reached out with that new sense inside her, a tendril of warmth and life into the cold soil. She felt the sleeping roots stir. She felt the faintest trickle of water begin to move. It would take time, but it would live again. She could feel it. When she opened her eyes, Callum was holding a cup of wine. He offered it to her, and they drank from it together, a silent ceremony of their own making. "What will you do with her?" Sigrid asked, her voice soft. "With Alara." Callum's jaw tightened. "She threatened you. She tried to have you killed. In my kingdom, the penalty for that is absolute." "No," Sigrid said, placing a hand on his arm. "I want to speak with her." He did not want to allow it. She could see the protective fury in his eyes. But he nodded. He would deny her nothing. They brought Alara to the garden. She looked smaller now, stripped of her power and her audience. Her fine gown seemed out of place in the quiet solitude of the garden. "Why?" Sigrid asked simply. "Why did you hate me so much?" Alara was silent for a long time, staring at the barren rose bushes. "Hate you?" she finally whispered, her voice brittle. "I didn't hate you, you foolish girl. I was terrified for you." Sigrid stared, confused. "Terrified?" "My sister," Alara said, her voice cracking. "Your mother. She had it too. The gift. The life in her hands. Not as strong as yours, but it was there. And the king. Your father. He loved her for it. He paraded her, showed her off like a prize. He made her the symbol of his reign's prosperity." She took a shuddering breath. "And when the blight came, when the crops failed for 3 seasons straight, who did they blame? Her. The life-giver who had failed them. They called her a witch. They turned on her. And your father, the king, he let them. He stood by and let a mob tear her apart to save his own throne." The story was a physical blow. Sigrid felt the air leave her lungs. "I was there," Alara choked out, tears finally streaming down her cold face. "I saw it. I married him afterwards to protect you. And when I saw the gift waking in you, I did the only thing I could think of to save you from the same fate. I cast you out. I branded you. I made you so worthless no man of power would ever look at you, so you could live a small, safe life in obscurity. I tried to save you from the throne, but you foolish, stubborn girl, you came right back to it. It was a twisted, terrible kind of love, a mother's protection, warped by trauma into cruelty. She wasn't a villain. She was a mirror, a reflection of what could happen when love and power collided. Sigrid walked to her stepmother and, to Alara's shock, embraced her. She held the stiff, trembling woman. "I forgive you," Sigrid whispered. Alara broke, sobbing into her shoulder, years of guilt and fear pouring out. She was not executed. At Sigrid's request, Alara was given a quiet manor on the southern coast, far from the politics of the court, where she could live out her days in peace. It was a mercy she didn't deserve, but one Sigrid needed to give. 3 months later, spring came to the north. But it was a spring unlike any the kingdom had ever seen. The fields yielded a harvest so bountiful they had to build new granaries. The forests were thick with game. The castle gardens, once barren, were a riot of color and life, their scent drifting through every window. Sigrid stood on the balcony of their chambers, Callum's arms wrapped around her from behind. His chin rested on her shoulder, his warmth a constant, reassuring presence at her back. "The people are calling it the Queen's blessing," he murmured into her hair. She smiled, leaning back against his solid chest. "The land is happy." "I am happy," he corrected, his voice soft and deep. He placed a hand on her still flat stomach, a gesture of quiet hope and boundless love. The bond between them was a living thing, a current of warmth and strength that flowed constantly. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. The lines of care were still there, but they were softer now. The haunted look was gone from his golden eyes, replaced by a deep, steady contentment. She had healed more than just a wound in his side. She had healed the centuries of loneliness. He had saved her from exile, and she had saved him from himself. "Does it hurt?" she whispered, tracing the old scar through his eyebrow, a reminder of the life he'd lived before her. He captured her hand, kissing her fingertips. "Not anymore," he said. She looked into his eyes and saw the truth of it. The cold king was gone, melted by the spring he had searched for his entire life. "Liar," she teased softly, a smile playing on her lips. He returned the smile, a slow, genuine thing that still made her heart ache. "All right," he conceded, his voice a low rumble. "Maybe a little, but it's a good hurt." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers. "It's the hurt that reminds me I can feel again." And as he kissed her, with the scent of her gardens rising up to meet them and the sounds of a thriving kingdom below, Sigrid knew she was finally, truly home. The cold was just a memory. Here, in his arms, there was only warmth.